Hey, Erez, thank you for coming in and sharing your experiences with my audience. You have just a marvelous, wonderful sort of profile and background of things that you've done and contributions you're continuing to make, and just a marvelous history. So, thank you, and I recommend people look at your profile as well. So, thank you again for coming in and sharing your wisdom with our audience.
Yes, my pleasure. Looking forward to this conversation.
So, Raz, what were the three, inflection points in your life that made you who you are today? And this could have been 3 or 5 years old. It could have inside, outside the family. It could have been opportunities and challenges. What is that mix that made this really remarkable person you are today?
A beautiful question because I do believe that, the experiences and the events that we go throughout life do form who we are. The question is, do we allow these experiences to actually allow us to transform and grow, or do we become more victims of the circumstances? So for myself, I would say, one of the biggest areas that really formed who I am without knowing who I am was the place I was born. I was born in Israel, which we know the history of the place and unfortunately the volatility of what's going on there. But that was an environment that really shaped me almost unconsciously to become more resilient and adaptive to life and changes. And unfortunately, on that level, it was risk related, but that translated into many other things. In that environment, in Israel, we do serve in the military. It's mandatory service for men and women. For myself, knowing that I will serve for at least 3 or 4 years, the intention was always to do my best and aim for the best unit I can serve in. And I ended up being selected to one of the top elite commando units of the Israeli Air Force, which at the time I didn't really realize that it wasn't the military training that will shape me. It would be the experiences of what these trainings will allow me to do afterwards in life. So I would say that was one of the more formative events, but not really by my own understanding of what has happened. And as I continued in life, I did choose to live outside of Israel afterwards, traveled the world for a long time, did a lot of solo travel. I'm a very adventurous person by nature, and ended up building my home and raising my family in Canada, in Vancouver. And here I was confronted with more experiences that really were the inflection points of becoming more aware of what has happened during the situations that I was encountered with.
So you mentioned earlier serving in the Israelis, kind of very special unit, and that those experiences were very defining for you. And so very early on, I mean, it's very competitive to get into the top elite units. What inspired you to sort of, in essence, it's like a competition to get into and be selected in that way? Was it within your family that kind of drove you to say, you got to work really hard and study hard to get selected into this program? And when you were very young, were you curious and always kind of challenging yourself? I mean, did you have an interest in, or what were the interests you had, like in school and things like that? And so, what were the things that shaped you to, try to get into this elite unit?
Yeah, that's always a very interesting place to understand what makes someone choose these paths. And I think for myself, I wasn't raised in a family of, warriors and soldiers and elite unit kind of pedigree. I was very adventurous by nature from a very young age. I spent most of my weekends in the desert and climbing mountains and canyoneering and caving and doing all sorts of adventure travel. And that was my kind of synagogue in nature, for a lack of a better description. When I was young, that was my refuge from day-to-day life. I really felt connected and well protected in these environments. And
Did your parents drive you to that though? That
not at
explore?
all.
No.
My parents are from they have a medical history and background. My father is a doctor. My mother was a social worker and then became a manager of two hospitals in Israel. So they were very linear thinkers and very grounded in their approach. I was a bit of an odd child in my family where I just freedom was something I seeked all the time. And they were kind enough and I think accommodating enough to just let me explore and on my own discover what it is that I really enjoyed and loved, which took a lot of trust on their end or lack of knowing of what I really did when I was out in nature. But I think from a very young age, people are drawn to do certain things in life. And for myself, the freedom to pursue it was really important. So when I grew up in these environments, outdoor adventures and doing all these things, I just met amazing people from different backgrounds that have done amazing things in their lives. And my early experience was with actually veterans from several elite units in the Israeli Air Force. I really wanted to be in search and rescue, to be honest. That was my my dream, and I was actually preparing since I was 13 years old to participate in the selection process for search and rescue. But the Israeli military has different ways of how they choose people. And for me, during that selection process, I was just earmarked to a different unit, which I didn't even know what it was at the time. And I'm a competitive person by nature. I was a competitive swimmer. I represented Israel in international competitions, and I was always very high achiever profile, you could say. So I would say these are the things that really naturally turn to be that.
Okay, so your mother has a social working background and ends up managing hospitals, and your father's a doctor. So there's this kind of medical science rigor. So did you have a curiosity about science and math and things like that?
Yes, I was always intrigued by just to understand how the world works to begin with as a young child, and then a young adult to understand how things happen and why. So the science of life was very embedded, I would say, in my worldview and the environment I grew up with. The conversations, the curiosity was a lot around that. But what wasn't introduced into that equation was the inner um, exploration of the side of why do we do certain things, are we attracted to other things, and that came later in life. But the early days certainly served that.
Right. So you had an intellectual curiosity, you had a physical curiosity, and that's why you did things like exploring and climbing and caving and whatever. And then you had this interest in search and rescue, and yet you got selected into this very elite unit. And in that elite unit, do you know what they would select on? I mean, I guess they would select on aptitude, the fact that you were a high achiever, um, you would represent your country in different athletic pursuits. They would look at those kind of. Do you have an idea why you were selected?
So at the time, I had no idea because the requirements of building soldiers to facilitate a certain purpose um, changes all the time. And for me, search and rescue was a very different approach to become a warrior and a commando elite soldier. Those are, they have some parallels, but on the most part, they're very, very distinct. In retrospect, after serving in this unit and learning what, they do and how we select soldiers today, I really realized that one of the main areas that we look at is how people operate under extreme pressure, meaning those selection processes what they try to do is to put you in environments where you just can't operate, with your logic intact and with your reasoning in place. And they get you to be in that position through, very, very harsh physical and mental conditions. So they break you down and then they see the real you. And they put you under certain tests and circumstances to see who shows up. And I think that is one of the main areas that we can become who we truly are without the filters of our mind and how we think we should be. And that's a huge selector criteria.
Israel is quite famous that if you get selected into one of these elite units, the graduates come up and they become entrepreneurs. And they found the biggest companies in the world and or become very, very successful. It's like a badge that will help you with success. Did you find that then?
I think that if I would have stayed in Israel, that would have been the case because it is a badge of honor and it's almost like, kind of a selected club that people know each other. There's the reputation of not just serving in the military in that capacity. I think the environment, because you serve for 3 or 4 years, sometimes five, um, gets you to experience what military connections, interaction with different types of innovation provides you with. And that is a huge door opener. I know a lot of my teammates that remained in Israel. All of them have ended up in very successful positions. A lot of it due to connections, background, and abilities that were developed in the early days. But there's a camaraderie, I think, that takes you into those other civilian opportunities together.
Yeah, I mean, Israel's unusual, and there's such a tight integration between what happens in the military, with the universities, with the entrepreneurship, with capital, with the startup ecosystem, known as the startup nation, and all of it's really compressed. And I know that you serve in one of these elite units. It's like a golden ticket, and in fact, parents want their kids to, if they're going to serve, get selected, right? So that must have been, um, I mean, that would have been interesting for your parents to see you selected into one of these units, even though they came from a more traditional medical background. But I mean, it's a desire, isn't it, in Israel to have somebody be selected in one of those units, and you get selected. So you do your service within one of these elite units, and and the graduates are of those elite units are the kind of the chosen ones in essence, right? And you wear that badge, and it's lifetime. So what did you do immediately after you served?
So for me, the experience was a little bit different, I would say, to the normal path, because serving in the military and understanding the motivation for operations and how things are done and war in general really exposed me to a part of life that I didn't agree with.
Yeah.
I wasn't born to be an elite commando warrior, I have to say. I was adopted and kind of had the capacity to participate in that in a very good way. And I found my way throughout my service to do the best I can with my capacities. But the military experience was followed by, um, again, the uprising in the Middle East happens every so often from different circumstances, from different things. But what I realized was that I didn't really want to live in an environment of war and conflict for the rest of my life. And my military experience showed me the inner workings of that and a more understanding that this is the reality of this region. And if I was to stay, I would probably ended up in either a long-term military career or maybe a political career just because of my nature. And both weren't very appealing for me. So that's when I started to look outside of the country. And I began by just wanting to study outside of Israel. And I studied in England for 3 years. And that was really my introduction to, wow, there's another world out there.
So
And we
so
all
what
have a
did you
choice.
What did you study in England?
So in England, I studied marketing and business, but the original subject I wanted to study was tourism and business because my vision was I wanted to build an adventure tourism company for the
Uh,
Middle East, meaning we will travel freely and openly with, our friends in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Egypt and all these beautiful places that unfortunately I realized will not happen. And then I changed my career path and decided to focus more on business and marketing. And that really opened up an entire world of, oh, if I was to pursue something outside of Israel, my life could look different. And I made a choice at that time to pursue that.
okay, so you do three years in England, right? And then eventually adventure tourism. So I could see that because you had this really love of nature and all of your activities are nature based in some way, communing with nature. So that's very much adventure tourism. But you realize because you grew up in a region which is has some uncertainty, you realize, well, maybe I should more focus on the marketing business side rather than the adventure tourism. So where did you go from your 3 years in London?
So 3 years in London opened up my eyes to what does it take to live outside of Israel, to develop a life, to build a career. And I actually started from scratch right after my studies in England, in the US, where I pursued a real estate career of all things, just because of a good opportunity that came about. And I think the ability to adopt, to work with change, to work with uncertainty, to be able to pursue something not knowing what the outcome would be really served me very well. That was an adventure on its own, to be honest.
So where did you end up in North America then, and when you started doing real estate?
So North America started with New Jersey, of all places. That's where the opportunity was. I always say if I would have landed on the west coast of the US, my experience with America would have been a little bit different. But I've spent a couple of years, Florida and New Jersey around real estate, realizing that the lifestyle and what I was looking for my future family wasn't necessarily aligned with that kind of life. And that's when I was introduced to Canada, traveled there for about 2 months, and really realized that that would be the future home for my family, and ended up in Vancouver, Canada, 22 years ago.
So okay, and so you have this interest in real estate in New Jersey, and it yeah, the East Coast is quite different than the West Coast. And you again, you're going through these um, personal kind of reflective thinking, right? Gee, that's not really a life I want. And then you end up in Vancouver. Why Vancouver? What's attractive about Vancouver?
My belief, and I think this is something that has driven me my entire life, is that within the confines of whatever the world shows us, we do have a choice. And for me, making these choices consciously and driven by what I can control versus what I can't has always been a guiding principle. And I think that for myself, when I started to look at, okay, if Israel is not going to be the place where I will raise my family and grow up there, I I was to choose a place that at least will align with as many things that I believe uh, present a good place to live in. And Vancouver, Canada was the place that showed me a beautiful combination of safety, nature, um, unbelievable freedom across the board. And it was a choice. It wasn't a good financial choice at the beginning because my career was really being more um, successful, I would say, in the States in terms of potential and growth and everything else. But the lifestyle choice took precedence.
Right. And I guess that gets back to your roots, right? You wanted the ability to commune with nature, and then actually in Vancouver, it's minutes away basically, and you can commune with all sorts of different kinds of nature, right? So
Yes.
whether it's mountains or streams or rivers and the ocean, I mean, you can experience all, and like you said, in a safe environment. It's a very safe and stable here, and it's multicultural. So you get experience with the different kinds of mentality and people. And the West Coast vibe is more relaxed, right?
Yeah, it's
Than
very
East Coast.
different. Very, very different. I know.
Okay.
And with all this, relaxation and ideas of how to rebuild my business and again start from scratch in a new country with no connections, no backup, no nothing. Again, provided another level of challenges and experiences. And I did pursued my real estate career in my early years here in Canada and managed to build a very successful company, actually several companies within the industry. But later on, again, life just showed up, and it showed up in the presence of a fully semi-truck head-on collision that happened in 2011. And that was, again, another huge shift in my life and how I ended up where I am today.
So let's mine these companies that you created well in Vancouver. So again, um, I see your life in a series of rebirths. Right. So you had another rebirth in Vancouver, and well, so talk us through some of these companies, and
Yes. So again, I think having the DNA and the ability to just pursue the unknown served me well as well, because when I came in the US, I actually was able to build two real estate companies through partnerships. So I had the ability to kind of rely on experience, credit ratings, and local people that really helped me pursue investments and projects that I wasn't able to if I was on my own. When I came to Canada, I didn't have any of that. I had the knowledge, but I didn't understand the need to rebuild my entire, credit history
yeah.
and my credibility of who I am, and how I do business and all the rest of it. So I started with a very risky business. I actually started with renovating small apartments. I would get mortgages, which are kind of in the gray market zone, 20, 22% interest rates. And I would just go into project that I would know within 3, 4 months I'm in and out, and just hope that I'll sell for more than I bought and did some improvements. And the model worked for the first couple of years and started to attract more and more interest in how I do business. And then investors came on board, banks became a little bit more cooperative, and the business started to grow from there to something more substantial.
So, but you said a series of businesses, so all related to this kind of taking places and improving them and then reselling and turning them over?
That was at the beginning because I call myself at the time I was a real estate entrepreneur. I wore multiple hats within the industry, from construction, renovation, and then land assemblies, development. But I think what I loved in the industry was the ability to identify opportunities. So be that land zoning that wasn't optimized, or buildings or infrastructure that could have been utilized in a different way, and to take it from that core usage and really put a process in place that will transform it into something else, more valuable, of course, but also something more modern and more usable. That was a natural progression that I did, but had to learn everything from me doing construction all the way up to, running a company with several partners and employees all across Canada and some projects in the US as well at the time.
Right. So you built these businesses, and you're living the dream in Vancouver. It's a playground, a different season playground. So you got to explore all of your nature aspects as well. And it's a safe environment. And then something catastrophic happened. So, and that changed your life. And as much as you can, describe how that transformed your thinking.
Yes, this is an interesting observation on your end because living the dream was a kind of a fantasy world. Because as I grew my business and became more successful, on the monetary side, things were a little bit more stable, especially with a young family. At that time, I had my youngest was born at the time. She was maybe a year old, and my eldest, she was about 3.5. And my marriage actually changed at the time. My relationship, I was married to an Israeli woman who traveled the world with me and was extremely adventurous and started from scratch every place we got to. And here in Canada, I think the pursuit of stability kind of hid the problems within the relationship at the time. And when things started to get a little bit easier, I realized that that relationship wasn't the right one. And we went our separate ways, raised our children together, but in joint custody. But I think that was a big hit for me, realizing that here it is. You can pursue a career, but if your home life is not where it should be, get ready for some big shifts. And that really rattled my world and affected my business in a terrible way because the divorce wasn't an easy one. But at the end of the day, I started to rebuild my business. And as part of rebuilding my business, I started to travel a lot in Canada. And in one of those trips, I was actually going up to northern British Columbia, where I live. And this is a very notorious highway. It's called the Coquihalla Highway here in BC. It was a full-on snowstorm, nothing new to me. I've been in these environments many times before, but this one was different. I hit a patch of black ice. My vehicle lost control. And as my vehicle lost control, I knew that this was a very different experience. And here I was, hit the concrete median between the two lanes. The car launched in the air, flipped upside down, dropped on its roof in the opposite lane, straight into an oncoming semi-truck. Head-on collision, broke my body into a billion pieces, and waited almost 3 hours for the rescue teams to come and get me out. Um, that was my first near-death experience out of three that I will have in a decade. But that point of impact, I realized that the person I was before the accident will not survive this recovery. And that was the beginning of a huge transformation.
And this transformation was from a spiritual kind of inner person standpoint, and or I'm guessing, and sort of reflecting on what you considered valuable for life and for the world and things like. Or can you describe that initial transformation through this near-death experience,
Yes,
spiritually and as a person?
that was again a remarkable process to go through, extremely, extremely painful and devastating physically. But the realization that the journey outwards doesn't really lead to any place of inner peace and inner understanding because you always chase something. And as soon as you get it, you want to chase the next thing and the next thing. And for me, the realization was that the person that made who I was up until then, including the military service experience and all the other business experience and everything else, was called to change. And that change was a very clear message at the time, which is actually what I do today in my work, working with leaders and organizations to really understand the inner workings of how we operate, especially under pressure and change and circumstances that are outside of our control. Because that accident could have taken me to a very different place of being disempowered. I was actually disabled from that accident. But the journey itself and the realizations were so deep in terms of, okay, I need to really understand I how I am wired and what drives me and what is it, within the circumstances which were horrific at the time, what choices do I have? And that was a powerful process to go through.
And so, in this process, can you describe what you consider the choices you had and how has the path of your life changed from that moment? And then there's other moments as well, but from that moment, um, your perspective of business and real estate and construction and things like that, did that change? Um, in terms of your interaction with your family, did that change? In terms of what you set to be your next goals, did that change?
Everything changed
Yeah.
in a fraction of a second, not realizing at the time the impact it will have. But of course, the first stage of it was pure survival. The injuries were devastating. I was very lucky to survive. Later on, I was told that a very small percentage of people that go through an impact, a head-on collision with the damage that I sustained, would even survive it. So I was, I think, lucky to have a physicality that was a little bit more robust and strong, and definitely goes back to my youth and kind of adventure ability. But as things started to stabilize a little bit, I realized that what I have done in the past and what I pursued in the past is just not going to cut it. This is not a way for me to pursue because my injuries, the life-threatening injuries, stabilized within the first 3 months. But I had a very difficult injury. My right leg shattered into 17 pieces. My ankle was crushed. And that was a minor accident, damage from the accident, that leg. Everything else was horrifically broken. All my ribs, my sternum, internal organs, everything else. But I was disabled after the car accident. I was on crutches and in a wheelchair, realizing that pursuing my career in real estate, which involved a lot of travel, meetings, on-site supervision, and things like that, just can't happen anymore. Fathering my children in that condition was extremely challenging. Um, Trying to go back to where I was before the accident was just a futile effort as far as I was concerned. And that journey started to really shift how I operate.
And then, so you left real estate then, or and then how did you shift from a career standpoint? But you also had to rebuild yourself, right? Physically in some ways. And as you mentioned, you were in a wheelchair and things like that. So did you undergo some kind of self-driven program to get physically more able and so on? I mean, what was that journey like?
Yeah, so that was I call my PhD in human recovery and in mental strength, because at that point I'm a curious person by nature. I love to study and learn. My entire life I will be a student of life, and that was by necessity at the time. So I really needed to understand how to support my body for healing, for recovery, be that from bone fractures to a mild concussion, to understand sleep, nutrition, exercise, modalities that I found the West to be a little bit more restrictive, opened up the entire Eastern philosophy of life. And I was on an amazing journey of realizing Eastern methodologies from Ayurveda to pranayama to yoga to meditation to different things that I experimented with just to see what works and what doesn't work. And that was, I would say, the most profound journey I went through, because everything I've studied, I implemented in my life, and certain things worked and certain things didn't. So the trial and error was just an incredible, I would say, almost 18 months, because after the accident, and as I said, things stabilized, I realized that with my condition of my ankle, I will never be able to be active again the way I used to. And it opened up a process where I had to make the toughest decision in my life at that point regarding my health and how I want to pursue it.
And that would be your elective surgery, right? And
Yeah. Yeah, that was a choice against the advice of some of my doctors, a choice to electively amputate my leg below the knee. And that choice, I have to say, was a transformational point because it was a choice from a place that I felt the choice is mine, the decision is mine, but I had to take into account the outcome, which could have been 50-50. You chop off a leg, it doesn't grow back. So it can get a lot worse or a lot better. But by making the decision, because I was in this place of no decision, unknowns, and really just couldn't live my life, making that choice provided freedom by making the choice first. And afterwards, the recovery and everything else, based on everything that I've learned and experienced, allowed me to get a better grasp on what it takes now to live life without a limb, but also get back on track on my physical path.
let's say once you completed that journey, so you went through trying all sorts of different kind of philosophies. Some worked, some didn't. What's the end result of that period of going through the philosophies? And you go through an amputation, but then you can have a prosthetic, and maybe that prosthetic is actually more useful, um, because in that whole area is maturing and growing even rapidly, right? So in your exploration process, once that journey was completed, what was this new person like? Can you describe this new era's
Yeah,
person?
yeah, that was the new eras for sure because I had to let go of a lot of pre-assumptions, a lot of false beliefs that I developed throughout life, and served me to a certain degree, I think, when I was younger. But in this particular situation, understanding that you have to work with what you have, but you can develop a lot of areas that can contribute to that. So for me, the deep dive into human physiology, neurology, behavior, and really understand that the pursuit of a change and a transformation, 90% of it is regarding how we think, our self-beliefs, and where we are in a particular time in life. And I was almost forced into that because, I wouldn't choose that path as a transformative path. But because of the circumstances, everything had to happen relatively quickly and very, very deeply. So there were no shortcuts there.
So describe this new person. I mean, is it like you wake up, you do yoga, you're physically different, and then how has that transformed in terms of your goals? Like you do what motorbiking, right? Things like that. So, uh, what does life look like for you now? I mean, you're not doing real estate anymore, right?
Mhm.
So what does that mean from a career standpoint?
So from a very physically active, outdoor, adventurous person to inhabit a body now that doesn't function well and you can't really do a lot of physical things, that was a very challenging place to be in because you're with yourself now and you're kind of stuck. The physical engagement, the busyness of life almost came to a standstill. So starting to learn how to be more comfortable with myself, how to control my emotions, my um, cycling into these spirals of catastrophizing life and the world and what happens. This became very, very supported by mindful practices. I've learned and practiced, and I think this was a huge transformation for me. The science of pranayam, which is how we use the breath and how it interacts with our minds. through different modalities. My nutrition changed completely. At one point, I was almost completely um, plant-based for a certain time to help my healing and reduce inflammation. But after that, I chose a very different lifestyle in terms of how I interact with nutrition, with sleep, with even agitating consumption of social media or news or things like that. All of those things had to change drastically to create an environment for healing, but also an environment that allowed this new Erez to kind of show up through that. And I think once I recovered, just the physical part of it was stable, and the decision to go with the amputation happened. Um, all of those areas that I've studied came to life to support the next step.
And the next step is how have you transformed your career in terms of what you do for a living?
So the next step was more ego-driven than career-driven, I would say, because after the amputation, there's a phenomena when a limb is severed. It's called phantom limb pain, which is the most excruciating pain anybody can experience. And my doctors warned me that this could happen. I said, okay, I'll take the risk. And yeah, it did happen on my end. But again, I managed to um, work with this debilitating condition through a very specific methodology called mirror therapy, which is more, again, a mindful visualization, meditative type of approach, but scientifically proven to work if you let it work. And that was my journey to kind of go against the grain at the beginning and not letting the methodology work, and then understand how to change and let it work. And that eliminated my phantom limb pain. And that opened up the adventure life again, because I was able to operate with my prosthetic limb in a very active way. And I pursued my adventure life after that, started to ride motorcycles again, actually pursued the world toughest, longest off-road race in the world called the Dakar Rally, and started to train like, again, like an elite commando to participate in that race, which in a pre-qualifying race, I was unfortunately involved in a devastating accident again that almost took me out. But that accident showed me that, again, going back to where I wasn't the right path. And that was the second event in my life that provided another transformation.
And so you take on this challenge of the Dakar a rally, which is really famous, but you also had another accident. But your prior accident will informed how to recover from this accident.
Yes, that was a huge realization for me that I've actually started to develop certain modalities and systems and protocols that by necessity I developed at the first accident and then in preparation for my amputation, because I had about a year to prepare for the amputation. It was an elective. I had to go through some other surgeries and things in between. So when the second accident happened, it was like almost on autopilot to, okay, what are the tools, what are the methods, what are the things that I used in the past that worked, and now I can use even faster to recover and rebuild. And that was a realization where science and kind of the more call it the mindfulness side of life came together in a very quick way to help my recovery.
And then you have a heart attack, right, as well.
So, after the pursuit of the ego-driven macho guy on a motorcycle driving through deserts all over the world, I realized that I'm done with chasing outside experiences. And that's where really my career changed. I started to do more consulting work. A lot of my real estate clients and kind of environment and organizations I worked with just came and asked me, hey, if you can't do the work for us, can you consult and help us do the things that you did in the past? And that was 2 years of just an amazing early stages of developing this consultancy and coaching environment. And when I thought everything was in a great place, I was involved in a small accident, just someone rear-ended me, no real damage, no nothing that you can speak of compared to anything else. But that triggered a horrific cascading response from my body that within a month I could hardly remember anything. I would mumble. I couldn't sleep. I was deteriorating very, very fast, not knowing what was going on. And that deterioration ended up with a full-on heart attack. At the time, I thought I was at the peak of my health and changed my career. I'm not in the stressful environment of real estate, and I thought life was really good. And that was, I have to say, the most difficult near-death experience out of those three that I had.
And then out of that, you're now a resiliency expert, right? And entrepreneur, business strategist. Can you talk about the academy you founded and what you're doing today and the expertise that you bring to the people out there and to the world?
Yes, that was, I believe today, really wholeheartedly, that the most difficult challenges people encounter are given to those who can actually overcome them. And when you overcome them, you have a choice. You have a choice to just overcome them for yourself and go back to whatever life you want, or you overcome them and now it is an invitation for you to actually start and share them with the world. And what I realized after the heart attack was an immense value in those protocols, systems, ways of thinking, and operating under stress and uncertainty that my recovery from the heart attack was amazingly, I wouldn't say fast because time is subjective, but internally the ability to understand that what has happened to where I can take it was quite remarkable. And after the heart attack, I really put a lot of time and effort to develop a system. It's called the Resilience Edge operating system that I just distilled into a very practical form of operating under pressure and under uncertainty, and how to bring it into your business life, your personal life. And today I work with organizations and leaders that are under constant uncertainty, volatile situations around their work, their markets, their life. And how do you embed that system in a way that they can actually utilize and see the return on their effort? They don't need to go through three near-death experiences and develop their own system. And it became a very practical and distilled process. I would say one of the major elements in that system today is how to make decisions under pressure and how to stay calm and centered during those situations. And nothing is more real as today's, disruption around AI and the world and the markets to see how this operating system can be of use. And this is really what I do today.
And so your clients are located globally. How do they get in touch with you? How do prospective people who hear your amazing life story, resilience and recovery, but resilience and also then in transformation and doing global good, how do they engage with you?
So the best way, I mean, my main platform is LinkedIn. They can learn a lot about my story and what I do and how I operate there. I did a TEDx talk, so they can search the TEDx under my name as well, and my website, just erezavramov.com. And really, what I've learned over time was that resilience has a connotation sometimes to a soft skill. It's kind of, something nice to have, but I don't know, some people have especially after COVID, it was overused and not necessarily properly addressed. I believe today that the ability to adopt to change and to operate under pressure, the underlying ability to do all these things is the resilience core. And how it's developed, that's really the process that I share with people today. And hopefully, not just ordinary circumstances, but extraordinary as well. So the more I evolve in my methodologies and teaching, the more I get involved in very volatile, high risk, high impact scenarios where the decisions carry substantial impact.
So do people, when they want to engage with you, is this one-on-one or do you have a team as well? How does that work?
So I operate in a variety of ways. One thing that I do keynote speaking about the subject and really introducing the whole journey and the process. That talk usually can lead to a workshop. So I do a lot of half day, full day retreat type of workshops on how to integrate the Resilience Edge operating system into the businesses and into teams. And at the higher end, I work primarily very exclusive work with senior teams, and it sometimes lead to one-on-one, but one-on-one is really, I would say, a very unique circumstance where the match is there and the ability of the person is they're all in, and that's where I can give them the best of what I have.
Do you work with any members of YPO, this Young Presidents Organization, people like that at all? Or
So YPO is an organization I would love to work with. I work right now with a lot of local organizations in Canada. I work with Tech Canada, Vistage, EO. I had a few events with them, but I feel that these organizations have the platform to really, introduce concepts like this on a larger scale. And you know what I realized, especially from my keynote speaking, is that the message lands within certain industries in a way that they didn't think about it before. And now, when it's been introduced into their work, the changes are phenomenal. And that's my drive. That's my passion. This is why I do this work and continue to do this work and what gets me out of bed every morning. And the more complex the situation they confront, the better fuel it is for me to help them.
and so this is the last couple of questions. So first of all, consider this like a blank space, like a green field. What idea or concept would you like to introduce? So that we haven't discussed yet. And then the final question is what recommendations and questions you want to leave the audience. So is there some area that you want to, you know, talk about to the audience? And then those final two, what recommendations and questions to leave the audience?
Sure. I would say a subject to really think about, maybe through a different lens, is when we say resilience, the interpretation is very different to each and every one of us. I would invite people to look at resilience as the kind of the core foundation, that without that, all these different ideas and systems and techniques and whatever it is you're trying to achieve is compromised if that base is not strong enough. Where I find it to be tested all the time is through the lens of decision making. So I would invite your audience to think, if they're confronted with a very important decision to make, that the impact of that decision is, critical, be that revenue, manpower, competition, whatever the case may be. How do their worldview right now impacts the decision or the lack of decision because of the stress and the pressure and the unknown outcomes? And if the answer is, I am afraid to make that decision, or I'm uncertain on making the decision, or I try to delegate the decision to someone else in my company, or an external advisor or something like that. I think that's the entry point into this work, because the ability to understand how these decisions are made under pressure, that's a life-changing capacity to develop. So I would say that's an area to really focus on.
Okay, and then any additional recommendation and questions you would leave the audience?
Recommendation, I would definitely advise and invite people to maybe question areas where they keep hitting a certain glass ceiling. within their personal life or within their business. And if there's a repetitive pattern there that just happens to show up under pressure, under difficult circumstances, when the pressure is on and we default into that behavioral mode and thinking mode, I would invite people to really take that as an opportunity. There's a golden opportunity in identifying that pattern and starting to work with it in order to break through versus to get stuck again and again in that glass ceiling. And that is, I find when people are open to that exploration, my God, that's where magic happens.
Well, you definitely are the epitome of, and the pinnacle of this whole process, because you put it into action in so many different ways and throughout your entire life. So, Erez, thank you for coming in and sharing your wisdom and your experiences with our audience, and really a transformative journey, a series of transformations and rebirths as well. So that's remarkable. And you're training for as a Paralympics as a para archer too, I think, aren't you?
Yeah, I just took on archery a year and a half ago, and again, the high achiever in me is trying to reach the Olympics here. But we'll see where that goes. There's a reality of what it takes to become an Olympian and a business owner and a trainer and a public speaker and everything else. So I'm starting to realize all the moving parts and where they all land.
Well, that's again, you're always putting these uh, really remarkable goals, right? So you're never stopping. You're always working at the edge in essence as well, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, if
so
we stop, what's the purpose, right? I mean, we're here to really experience it all. So, yeah.
Whereas, thank you for coming in and sharing your experiences with our audience.
Thank you for having me. It was a beautiful conversation, and I hope it will be useful for your audience.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.